Welcome back to another episode of Vlogs of History After Hours. I'm your host, Darius Cousin, and if you've missed this week's episode of Vlogs of History, I do encourage you to go check it out. I'll leave a link right here and also in the description. Make sure you do. It's going to give you a lot of background information that's going to be very useful in understanding this video. So this week in Vlogs of History, we've talked about cowboys, the Wild West, and that whole era of American history. Well, what I want to talk about in this Vlogs of History After Hours episode is essentially what ended the cowboy era. What caused the end of such a beautiful yet short era? Well, as we've talked about in the Vlogs of History episode, the main reason for the end was, well, there were several reasons. One of which was the fact that they were transporting so much cattle from the south to the north that eventually there just wasn't enough cattle left to be transported. And because of that, well, the business became not so profitable anymore. But also, we've mentioned about the winter of 1886 to 1887. That winter was a horrible winter that really was the biggest cause of the end of the Wild West era and the cowboy era. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the winter of 1886. Now, before we jump into the winter of 1886, I want to give you just a little bit of background as to how the cattle were treated and how the cattle was organized during those times. Now, the term they use for this is called an open range, and an open range essentially means that the cattle was free to roam wherever it wanted on anybody's territory. Everybody had their own territory, but there wasn't really anything that was like a fence. There wasn't a fence or a sort of division between territories, and so the cattle, well, they were free to roam wherever they want. The way the ranchers, the way they would actually know which cattle was theirs and which wasn't, was they would mark the cattle with, I don't know what it's called, but it's the thing, I'm sure you all know it, it's the thing that's really hot and burning and that you mark the cattle with to say that, oh, this is my cattle. And so every year they would round up the cattle and then separate them according to who the cattle belongs to, and then you would do whatever you want to do with the cattle. For example, you could sell your cattle, you could, whatever, you were free. But the point is that the cattle was free to roam wherever it wanted to roam. That was the point. That wasn't until the barbed wire came to be. The barbed wire was invented in the 1860s, sorry, and it essentially, you had people that were for it and you had people that were against it. Those who were for it, well, of course, they wanted their territory to be protected, to be separated, and those who were against, well, think about this in the open range situation. Let's say that you have cattle and they're in the open range, and the water supply is on somebody else's territory legally, and that person decides to fence it off. Well, now your cattle that previously had access to water doesn't have access to any water anymore. And so you would be pretty angry about that. You would want to do something, and they did. They did a lot of wire cutting. A lot of wire cutting was happening during that time because, of course, some people did not like to have territories fenced off. So now that we have some background context, let's talk about the winter of 1886. Let's start about that summer of the same year. Well, that summer was unusually warm. For whatever reason, it was unusually warm, leaving the cattle lesser nutrition than before and a bit weaker than before. Then when the fall came, where there was already some signs starting that maybe the winter was going to be a bad one. For example, all the animals, the flying animals, they started migrating to the south faster. Beavers gathered more wood for protection and warmth than usual, and even the cattle, they grew thicker skins as if they were to prepare for something, and they did. In November, what happened was that there was a huge snowstorm like never before, and it lasted a long time. The whole month of November was snow covered in the south, which was very unusual, and it was cold too, but not deadly cold, but it was still cold. And then what happened in December, temperatures warmed a bit, which caused all of the snow that was there to kind of melt just for a while. That was for December. And then in January, when the cold temperatures came again, well, all of that slush, all of that melted snow became ice. And that was when things got really brutal, because for one, it was extremely cold. If it was that cold to have ice, it's very cold. It was always -0, and that was bad for cattle. Also, since you had ice everywhere, cattle could not really find grass. They couldn't really feed on the grass because there was ice covering it, and a cattle can't really break through the ice to get to the grass, which was a problem because a lot of cattle then died of starvation. Now, normally in such a situation, the cattle would flee somewhere. They would find refuge using the terrain as a refuge. But remember, barbed wires became a thing, and so a lot of cattle were stuck where they were. Some cattle tried to go through the barbed wire, eventually cutting themselves in the process and dying. or their cattle just remained there and died. Now the ranchers, well, they saw their cattle dying, but there was just nothing that they could do. They didn't even know how they could help the cattle. I mean, how would you help cattle in an open range, in an open field like that? How would you help your cattle? You couldn't. And so eventually all of the cattle died, and a lot of them died. By springtime, you had bodies all the way to the eye can see. You had bodies of dead cattle everywhere, and that really demotivated people. I mean, that was their supply, that was their business, that was their product. They couldn't sell it anymore because it was dead, and there was a new cattle being formed because the cattle weren't reproducing. And so a lot of people quit the open range industry, a lot of people quit the cattle drives industry. Also at the same time, the railroads were being constructed, and they were covering pretty much the whole country, and so cattle drives weren't that big of a thing anymore, and people just became demoralized and they started moving away because they're like, maybe the weather conditions would be better in the east. So add all of that together and you have yourself, like I said, the end of a beautiful era in American history. And I thought it was very interesting to share with you, and that you get some detail about the horrible winter of 1886 to 1887, because it was really a bad winter. It wasn't like anything we've ever seen before, and it really had a big impact in such a way that it managed to really halt and destroy the Wild West era, the cowboy era, and the cattle drives era. Alright, so that was it for this episode of Vlogs of History After Hours. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a like, share it to a friend, and subscribe to be notified when the next episode comes out. But remember, these episodes come out every single Wednesday, and the Vlogs of History episodes come out every single Monday. Once again, if you've missed this week's Vlogs of History episode, I do encourage you to check it out. I'll leave a link right here and in the description. As always, I'm your host, Darius Kozin. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.